And across the nation, royal enthusiasts rejoiced at the charming image of the future king stepping into the limelight. It was the kind of public moment the palace orchestrated with precision, an image of tradition preserved, and the Windsor bloodline reaffirmed. But for Queen Camilla, watching from behind closed doors, that same announcement hit with the force of a betrayal. She hadn't been informed beforehand. There were no private briefings, no subtle hints dropped in passing. She read about the honor bestowed on George just like the public did through a press release. For someone who had climbed her way up through decades of scorn, scrutiny, and scandal, being blindsided in this way was more than oversight. It was a message, one not delivered in words but in omission. Her family, her blood, was not considered, not even worthy of discussion. Camilla had spent years perfecting the royal image expected of her graceful, controlled, supportive. She played her role. So, well, many forgot the woman beneath the crown. But in that moment, as she read the release, that carefully maintained composure cracked. It wasn't about jealousy. She didn't begrudge George his moment. It was about what wasn't said, about who wasn't mentioned. Her grandson, Freddie Parker Bowles, wasn't even a footnote in the royal narrative. Despite her quiet efforts, despite his presence at events and his polished demeanor, he had been completely erased from the future being celebrated. And while the world saw progression, a young prince stepping forward, Camilla saw regression. She saw a monarchy retreating back into bloodline exclusivity. A fortress rebuilt around names like Windsor and Cambridge, with no room for those who married indeed or stood just outside. She saw the walls closing in again. There was no public reaction, no statement, no sign of disapproval. Camilla smiled politely at engagements that followed, exchanged pleasantries, and waved to crowds as expected. But behind her eyes, something had shifted. Her silence wasn't dignity. It was devastation. A quiet internal collapse masked by the poise of royalty. Because to her, that title represented more than tradition. It represented belonging. And for the first time in years, Camilla realized that no matter how high she had climbed, no matter how long she had endured, the doors of royal legacy would always remain shut to the people she loved most. But what the public didn't see was the silent war that began behind palace walls. She didn't cry out or fight back. She froze, realizing this time it wasn't about public hate, but the quiet erasure of her bloodline. For decades, Queen Camilla had walked a road paved with judgment. She had weathered more public backlash than most would ever survive. The woman once branded the destroyer of fairy tale royalty, the mistress who fractured the image of Princess Diana's perfect marriage, had clawed her way from villain to consort. She endured the tabloid slaughter, the sneers from crowds, the whispered condemnations in palace corridors, and somehow, through sheer resilience, she transformed that narrative. She didn't demand affection. She earned tolerance, perhaps even respect. But what no one saw coming was that the wound that would cut the deepest would be dealt not by the public, but by the very family she thought she'd secured a place within. When Prince George's title was announced, the blow didn't hit Camilla because it was undeserved. She admired the boy, loved him even. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about something far more intimate, far more painful recognition. The title wasn't just a ceremony, it was a signal, a statement to the world and to the institution. This is who matters, and by omission, this is who doesn't. Her grandson, Freddie Parker Bowles, didn't even warrant a mention. After years of carefully nudging him into the royal orbit, Camilla watched it all dissolve under a single headline. This time, the silence wasn't coming from the press or the people. It came from inside, from within the monarchy she had fought to join. The exclusion wasn't fueled by scandal or public disapproval. It was systemic, deliberate, almost clinical. and that made it all the more devastating. It was the unspoken rule that had hovered in the background of every royal event, every photo op, every carefully staged dinner. You may have earned your seat beside the king, but your family did not. Camilla's reaction wasn't loud. There were no outbursts, no scenes, just a chilling stillness that swept through Clarence's house. She cleared her calendar, skipped appearances. Aides whispered about her absence in hushed tones. Her presence, once steady and composed, began to flicker. Behind closed doors, she pulled away. She wasn't mourning a title, she was grieving the slow death of a dream she had dared to believe in. A dream that one day her grandchildren might not wear the crown, but at least stand near it. The fracture widened when she finally confronted Charles. It wasn't theatrical, just one question, asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Did you even try?" And in that question lived years of sacrifice, compromise, and loyalty. She didn't need him to win the battle, she just needed to know he had fought it. But his response, gentle and diplomatic, told her everything. The monarchy had made its choice, and it hadn't included her family. And at the center of her heartbreak stood one name the palace refused to utter. He never asked for a crown, only a place. But Freddie's name vanished the moment the palace made its choice, and Camilla felt every cut. Freddie Parker Bowles wasn't raised for royal spotlight. He didn't grow up in gilded halls or under the constant gaze of history. But he carried something else, a presence, quiet, respectful, and effortlessly composed. Freddie became a familiar face in the background of royal engagements, not by chance. Camilla had spent years carefully placing him where it mattered most. He wasn't forced into the limelight, but gently guided near it. A seat here, a photo there, a mention in a palace circular. It wasn't a campaign, it was a prayer. That maybe one day her grandson might be allowed to stand, if not beside the crown, then close enough to be counted. Camilla never pushed, never demanded. She knew how this institution worked, how fragile its traditions could be, and how easily the wrong move could shatter everything. So she kept it subtle, strategic. When palace photographers arranged their frames, she ensured Freddie was included. When invitations were sent for key events, she nudged his name forward. He was charming, polished, and perfectly mannered. The kind of young man who could hold his own at any royal function without attracting controversy. Slowly and ever so carefully, Camilla wove him into the tapestry one stitch at a time. But none of it mattered. Not when the title was announced. Not when the monarchy decided who would carry forward the legacy. Freddie's name didn't just go unmentioned. It vanished, erased with a single press release. Camilla's quiet labor, years of precision, all reduced to nothing. It wasn't that Freddie had been denied a title. It was that he had been made invisible. The message was loud and clear, even if unspoken. This family line stops here. Freddie wasn't blind to the shift. He may not have understood the full weight of royal politics, but he noticed the absence. He noticed when he wasn't called for events he once attended. He noticed the way conversations moved around him. And Camilla noticed too. Every hesitation, every silence. Because this wasn't just about one boy, this was about an entire lineage being quietly rejected. He had become the embodiment of Camilla's dream. A dream of a monarchy that could evolve, include, adapt. A monarchy where love and loyalty might count just as much as blood. But that dream died the moment the cameras turned on Prince George, and Freddie stood unseen behind them. Yet even quiet, dreams couldn't withstand the cold hand of tradition. For William, blood decides destiny. No sentiment, no step relatives. The title was, for George, Freddie didn't even enter the conversation. Behind the charm and carefully curated public image, Prince William has always been a man of discipline, a monarch in waiting, shaped not by whim, but by obligation. From childhood, he was reminded that the crown he would one day wear wasn't just a symbol, it was a burden. And in that world, everything must be clear, controlled, and absolutely unquestionable. So when it came time to assign a ceremonial honor representing the future of the monarchy, William didn't hesitate. There was no deliberation, no compromise, and certainly no room for debate. It would go to Prince George, the blood heir. And that meant Freddie Parker Bowles, despite his growing presence in the background, was never even considered. To William, this wasn't about cruelty. It wasn't even about Camilla. It was about the crown and the sacred duty of protecting its lineage from delusion, confusion, or even perception of favoritism. He believed in a monarchy that was streamlined and sharp, where titles were not handed out in gestures of affection, but earned through bloodline alone. In his view, a blended family had no place in defining royal legacy, not because they were lesser, but because they were not born into it. And so Freddie, no matter how composed, how loyal, how royal he appeared, was quietly excluded from the equation. Not because William disliked him, but because he didn't matter in the blueprint that had been meticulously drawn for the monarchy's future. A blueprint where every line was marked by blood, not bonds. It was a cold calculation, but a strategic one. William had seen what sentimentality could do to the royal image. He had lived through scandals, watched the monarchy's reputation rise and fall with every misstep. He wasn't going to risk blurring the lines, not for anyone, especially not for a step-grandchild, no matter how close or beloved. In a world governed by perception, Freddie represented risk, and risk had no place in the plan. Camilla's years of subtle maneuvering, her hopes stitched into silent gestures, were all swept away by William's refusal to bend. And the sting wasn't just in the rejection. It was in how effortlessly it was done, without announcement, without explanation, and without resistance. It was simply understood that Freddie did not qualify. There was no meeting, no conversation, just a quiet line drawn in the sand. For William, the monarchy was bigger than feelings. It was an institution first, and if keeping it pure meant shutting out anyone who didn't carry Windsor blood, then so be it. But if Camilla had hoped Charles might defend her, she was mistaken. Camilla expected her king to protect her family, but Charles stayed quiet, and his silence echoed louder than any royal decree. In the quiet corridors of Clarence House, Camilla waited not for a reversal of the decision, not even for public acknowledgement, but for something far more personal, a signal, a word, a gesture from Charles that said, "I see you. I see your pain, and I will stand beside you." But none came. The man who had once defied centuries of royal precedent to be with her now chose not to lift a single finger when it was her family's dignity on the line. Camilla had known what the crown required of them. She had paid its price in full. She had endured scandal, tolerated shame, and transformed herself from mistress to monarch. And she had done it all with one quiet hope, tucked deep inside, that Charles, if no one else, would honor her sacrifices by protecting what mattered most to her. But instead, when William made his decision final, Charles didn't push back. He didn't protest. He didn't even ask the question Camilla herself had whispered days earlier. Why not Freddie? To the world, it looked like business as usual. A proud king aligning with the future of the crown, stepping into his duty with wisdom and restraint. But behind the scenes, it felt like abandonment. And for Camilla, it wasn't the exclusion that cut deepest. It was the ease with which Charles accepted it. The man who once moved heaven and earth for her now wouldn't challenge a single protocol to support the grandson she quietly fought for. Camilla didn't lash out. She didn't accuse or confront with rage. That wasn't her way anymore. Instead, the disappointment settled in slowly, like fog rolling through the halls of the palace. Their private conversations turned cold, clipped. Small talk replaced true intimacy. Charles offered comfort, soft words, vague promises, quiet reassurances that there will be other opportunities. But Camilla had heard enough, because this wasn't about future chances. This was about what had just been lost. She had spent a lifetime navigating the brutal maze of royal acceptance. She had bent, conformed, disappeared when it served the narrative. But this moment proved the truth she had tried for so long to ignore. When it came down to it, the crown would always come first, even before her, even before her blood. Charles, in his silence, had made a choice, and it wasn't against her. But it certainly wasn't for her either. That's what made it hurt the most. He didn't slam the door. He simply refused to open it. And the deeper tragedy, Camilla's journey had never been about her alone. Camilla didn't fight for power. She fought for her family's place. But the palace never saw them as more than polite shadows. From the outside, Camilla had it all. The crown, the title, the seat beside the King of England. But behind the grandeur, behind the daily, rehearsed grace and unwavering composure, lived a quieter mission, one more personal than any royal duty. Her fight was never to sit on the throne. Her battle was to earn a place not just for herself, but for her children, for her grandchildren, for the people who bore her name but would never carry Windsor blood. Unlike others who had married into the monarchy with loud demands or scandalous ambition, Camilla played the long game. She understood the language of the crown. She didn't campaign or stir controversy. She knew better than to challenge the institution head-on. Instead, she worked from the shadows, using whispers instead of proclamations, subtle presence instead of confrontation. Freddie, Tom, and Laura were never thrust into the spotlight, but they were never completely out of sight either. She ensured they were close enough to be seen, close enough to feel like they belonged, even if only just. It was all deliberate. Every photo where Freddie stood near a senior royal, every mention of Laura in an internal palace memo, every carefully crafted seating chart. These weren't coincidences. They were Camilla's quiet rebellion, a soft but persistent campaign, not for titles, not for thrones, but for recognition. A silent message that her family, though not born royal, had earned the right to be considered part of its story. She believed that loyalty would speak louder than lineage, that discretion and duty might buy her family something even titles couldn't, dignity within the legacy. She never asked for grand gestures. No medals, no public declarations, just space, just presence, just a nod that her bloodline, while not Windsor, was still worthy of standing in the frame. But as the months passed and the institution remained unmoved, that hope began to crack. Freddie's name, once softly circulated in palace whispers, disappeared altogether. Tom and Laura, ever composed, stepped back further into silence, and Camilla, ever the strategist, began to see the truth. Her efforts hadn't failed because they weren't noticed. They failed because they were never meant to succeed. The monarchy had room for roles, but not for revisions. It would bend for romance, forgive scandal, even reinvent tradition when needed. But it would not make space for outsiders. Not truly, not deeply, not permanently. Her family, no matter how well behaved, how well positioned, how loyally supportive, would always be treated as guests in a house they would never be allowed to own. And as that reality set in, Camilla's quiet push slowed. The dinners ended. The photo ops dried up. The mentions ceased. Not because she had given up, but because the wall had been made visible, and no amount of subtle maneuvering could move it. But inside the palace, resistance came just as silently and more firmly. Kate wasn't cruel, but she was calculated. To preserve the Windsor image, Freddie's inclusion was quietly shut down without a word. Where William enforced the rules, Kate mastered the optics. She understood the monarchy not just as a lineage, but as a brand, an image that had to be guarded with surgical precision. Every public smile, every headline, every photograph was a thread in the tightly woven tapestry of royal legacy. And anything or anyone that risked unraveling that design, no matter how beloved, was quietly pushed out of frame. Freddie Parker Bowles may have been Camilla's pride, but to Kate, he was a complication. A reminder of a lineage that didn't quite fit the script she and William had worked so hard to restore. In private discussions, whispers occasionally circled about a possible honorary mention for Freddie, something symbolic, nothing grand. But even those hushed ideas died before they reached the surface. Because within the palace's innermost circle, every detail was scrutinized. And Freddie, despite his polish and poise, raised questions. Questions the future queen wasn't willing to answer. How would the public react? Would this be seen as nepotism? Would it blur the line between heritage and favoritism? Kate, trained in caution and raised by public scrutiny, saw only one path forward: clean, controlled, undisrupted. To her, royal tradition wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about the message. A monarchy that doesn't make exceptions. A monarchy that doesn't flinch under sentiment. Freddie's presence, no matter how innocent or unassuming, risked opening a door that Kate was determined to keep shut. A door that might make the public question what makes someone royal, and who gets to decide, and that uncertainty, that ambiguity, had no place in the dynasty she and William were protecting for their children. It wasn't personal. That's what made it so devastating. There was no animosity, no conflict, no outright denial, just silence. Freddie's name didn't come up in meetings. His face began disappearing from photos. The subtle nods of inclusion that Camilla had spent years orchestrating were quietly undone, not with confrontation, but with omission. And Kate, always calm, always composed, ensured the message remained unsaid but understood. Only Windsor blood belongs in the spotlight. Camilla watched the quiet erasure with growing dread. There had been no argument, no scandal, no misstep to explain it. Only a void where her grandson once stood. A deliberate absence carried out with grace and finality. And she realized that her hopes for Freddie hadn't been rejected. They had been deleted, as if they'd never existed. Camilla wasn't just excluded. She was erased from the future she helped shape. No headlines covered it, but Camilla's light dimmed. The events skipped, smiles faded, and behind closed doors, she mourned what might have been. There was no official announcement, no public explanation for her sudden absences. The Queen Consort. Once a steady figure at nearly every engagement began to vanish from the royal stage quietly, discreetly, especially when the events were hosted by William and Kate. The ones that highlighted the future of the crown. The events might have reminded people of the past and of the people left out of the future. Camilla pulled back, not in rebellion, but in resignation, because she had seen the truth written between the lines, carved into protocol and decisions made behind velvet curtains. Her family would never be part of what came next. Those closest to her noticed first. Her staff whispered about her silences. Her eyes, once quick with warmth, now stayed lowered during meetings. Her movements became slower, more automatic. Royal duties performed with the same precision, but none of the heart. She was doing the job, not living the role. And while the public still saw the same calm exterior, those behind palace walls described her with one chilling word: haunted. Freddie, too, began to notice. He didn't need a press release to understand what had happened. He just had to look around. His name, once occasionally mentioned in briefings, had disappeared. His invitations dried up. His face vanished from photographs. Camilla no longer tried to position him beside senior royals. The doors that had once felt slightly ajar were now firmly shut. And though he never said it aloud, the hurt showed in his eyes. He understood enough to know he wasn't welcome. For Camilla, This was the quiet collapse of a dream she had never dared speak too loudly. The realization that her family wasn't just excluded, they were erased. Not by scandal or disgrace, but by design. The royal machine moved on without them, and she was expected to smile and wave as if nothing had changed. But everything had. She kept showing up when she had to. She still stood beside Charles at national ceremonies, still fulfilled her obligations as queen consort. But there was a vacancy in her presence, a hollow note in her tone. She had given everything to the monarchy. Her past, her reputation, her identity. And now, standing at its peak, she understood the final cost. She was accepted, but only alone. In the end, the kingdom she helped hold together left her family standing. Outside its gates, she won the crown, but lost the legacy. In the end, Camilla stood alone, knowing her family would never walk the royal path beside her. There came a moment when even Camilla stopped fighting it. No more carefully placed photos. No more whispers about honorary titles. No more quiet lobbying behind closed doors. She understood truly and painfully that her chapter in the royal saga would end with her. The crown she now wore would never pass through her bloodline. Freddie, who once stood so close to the throne, would never be more than a forgotten footnote. And the people she had fought for, sacrificed for, protected in silence, they would not be remembered in the legacy of the monarchy. Not in name, not in title, not in history. This wasn't a scandal. There was no drama, only silence. That's what made it so haunting. Camilla had risen from the ashes of public hatred, rebuilt her image, won the right to stand beside the king. But now she realized what that crown really represented. Not inclusion, not transformation, survival, her survival, not her family's. Because while the palace had accepted her, it had drawn a hard line that excluded everyone who came with her. Charles, in his own way, thought it would pass. He believed she would adjust, move on, that the weight would fade. But he didn't see what had been truly lost. It wasn't just a title or a role. It was everything she had dreamed might finally be possible. The quiet hope that the people she loved most could walk through the doors she had opened, that her redemption might extend beyond herself. But instead, she had opened a door and found it led only to her own isolation. Behind every event, every wave to the crowd, every polished public appearance, that truth followed her. The monarchy had spoken not in cruelty, but in finality. It had drawn a line in tradition and dared anyone to challenge it. Freddie wasn't overlooked. He was excluded by design. Camilla hadn't miscalculated. She had simply dared to hope. There was no formal end to her efforts, no announcement that the dream was over. Just a growing distance, a gradual fading. Freddie stopped appearing at events. Tom and Laura slipped back into quiet civilian life. And Camilla kept walking. Still the queen consort, still beside Charles, but changed, quieter, heavier. Not in disgrace, but in disillusionment. The monarchy had offered her a title, but not a legacy. For her family, that was the final message. You can serve, you can endure, you can even wear the crown. But if you weren't born into the story, you'll never be allowed to write its next chapter. You're either part of the bloodline, or you're just passing through it. Camilla may have earned her title, but for the people she loved, the gates of the crown never opened. And now, the queen walks forward, knowing she walks alone. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.